Okay, let's talk broadly now. You have seen all the processes in project management per the PMBOK, and you're comfortable with them, I hope. It's time to look at project management from a higher level point of view, where we can see how all these individual processes interact with each other. Before we review these process interactions and interrelationships, let me show you where you can find these in the PMBOK, which is free to you once you join PMI. The PMBOK is organized by process category. Here you can see we are looking at scope management. You can scroll down the bookmark sidebar to find any of the process categories. The first page will always be a listing of the processes within that category. The quick summary of each process can be useful to view. Now let's look at where we see the inputs, outputs, and techniques for each process category. Each process in the category. We are still in the project scope management category, but have gone down one page. These are all the inputs and outputs, as well as tools and techniques that apply to each process. If you wanted to see a specific process, just click on the plus sign in the sidebar and you can zip right to a process you may want to review. Okay, that's how to use the PMBOK. Now let's look at these process inputs and outputs and see how they interact. First, let's take a look at the project charter. It is an output of the develop project charter process, but the project charter doesn't just sit there, so to speak. It is an input into the develop project management plan, and when you close a phase or the project, you will use the project charter again. Also, it's an input in several additional processes in the project scope management category too. Plan scope management, collect requirements, and define scope. The project charter is also an input in all the planning processes. Now, you knew this because it is an input in the develop project management plan process, which includes all of the other planning processes. So the project charter is created as an output in the develop project charter process and is an input in all the planning processes and closing processes. Remembering this will help you remember what is in the project charter. Remember, it's high level. Now let's look at the project management plan. This is an output of develop project management plan process. And of course, it's an input into all the other planning processes. So what does this mean? It means that once you do your plan scope management process and you have your scope management plan, that is also going to be an input into the plan schedule management process, because it is part of the project management plan when it is finished. Once you have the schedule management plan as an output of the plan schedule management process, it becomes part of the project management plan along with the scope management plan, and both are inputs into the plan cost management process, etc. Okay, let's look at the outputs for the scope management planning process. The scope management plan, of course, and the requirements management plan. These appear as inputs into both the plan schedule management process and the identify risks process. Now, can you think why the requirements management plan would be an input into the identify risks process? Give it some thought. The requirements management plan is also an output of the identify stakeholders process. That means the requirements management plan was updated in the identify stakeholders process. What would be the updates, do you think? The next scope management output to review is the requirements documentation. Remember what this output is about. You want to document as much as possible about the requirements so that everyone knows what they are working on and working toward. In Agile, these requirements are documented in an iterative way. Only the requirements of the current iteration are fully documented. The rest are in the backlog. Nonetheless, they must be sufficiently elaborated while they are being worked on, regardless of which project lifecycle you are using. Now, the requirements documentation is an input for planning resource management and planning communications management. Can you think of why? Also, the requirements document is used as an input for identifying risks and identifying stakeholders. This makes sense too. I hope you can see that. Give it some thought. Linked to requirements documentation is the requirements traceability matrix. This document is vital. The requirements traceability matrix, as you remember, links product requirements from the beginning of the project, back when you were creating the project charter, to the deliverables. This matrix or grid also links each and every requirement to a business objective, not just a project objective. This helps make sure that every requirement adds value for your organization, not just the client or customer. You will use the requirements traceability matrix to keep on top of the requirements. The list could be lengthy, after all, not just whether they are being worked on currently or have been completed or are in the backlog, but also who is responsible for each requirement. The last use is to manage product scope. New requirements that are not on the list need to be handled through a change order procedure. Therefore, the matrix is an output of the collect requirements process and the define scope process, especially if requirements have changed during the project lifecycle. The matrix is also an input into the validate scope and control scope processes. Can you think of why? Let's look at the processes where the requirements traceability matrix is an input. Do these make sense to you? Remember, one function of the matrix is to tie requirements to the deliverables. Now look at the output column in the second grid. This matrix will be updated throughout the life cycle, which is why it is an output in so many processes. So by looking at the scope management plan, the requirements management plan, requirements documentation, and the requirements traceability matrix, you can see how the outputs of scope management knowledge area have a deep impact on many of the project processes. Now let's look at another process group, schedule management. You know that affects just about everything. There are so many processes in schedule management that they cannot all fit on the slide. I'm going to discuss only a few inputs and outputs. If you want to view all of these, please turn to the PMBOK 6th edition, page 174. Okay, now let's look at schedule and scope. The scope management plan is an input into the schedule management plan. This makes sense because the scope is what the schedule is needed for. Once the plan is set, then the scope baseline is an input into all schedule processes, again, for the same reason. Now, just a reminder, the scope management plan is an output of the plan scope management process, and the scope baseline is an output of the Create WBS process. Please remember this. Of course, the schedule management plan is an input into all schedule management processes. The plan guides all schedule work. Take a look at the develop schedule process and the control schedule process on the screen. One output of these is to update the schedule management plan. That's right, I said update it. Schedules are not set in stone, remember. Things happen and schedules need to be adjusted or updated. Now let's look at where the schedule management plan, where the milestone lists and the project schedule show up in other processes. Notice how the project schedule will be updated as an output of the determine budget process. Can you think of reasons why? Clearly, the project schedule will impact resource management and resource availability will impact the schedule, which is why we see the schedule as an input in resource management and updated schedules as an output. Now take a look at the final two processes, manage communications and plan stakeholder management. Remember, the project schedule is a communications tool. So of course it will show up in communications management and stakeholder engagement. Let's look at the activities that were decomposed in the Create WBS project of scope management and defined, sequenced, and given durations during the schedule management processes. The project activities will have an effect on budget, resources, and risks. Never forget that. Schedule management and cost management have a very interactive relationship. Let's look at this now. Looking at schedule and cost, we can see the interplay. Cost baselines are part of the schedule processes, and the schedule is part of the cost processes. Remember, performance baseline or performance measurement baseline, or PMB, is a combination of the scope, schedule, and cost baselines. Schedule and resource management have a lot in common too, so let's look at that now. See how the schedule and resources interact. Clearly, these processes are often done nearly simultaneously. The schedule depends on resource availability, and resources need to be estimated and acquired according to the schedule. Also, resource management outputs affect budgeting, specifically in cost estimating and budget aggregation. Remember, when you roll up the budget from the individual cost of activities all the way up so that you get an actual budget. The cost estimates will be used in resource management, including the basis of these estimates. Can you see why this is the case? The biggest interrelationship project communications management has is with stakeholder engagement. Now, I'm sure you can see why these two would be so tightly linked. Stakeholder management is highly linked to the other processes. Looking here, we see that stakeholder engagement interacts with resource management and risk management, in addition to communications management that we just reviewed. Speaking of risk, the processes for managing risk are also embedded in the other processes. Let's look at this in the next slide. Here we have all the inputs from processes other than risk management and the outputs of risk management to the other processes. You can see risk management affects everything. Please keep that in mind when you take the exam. Okay, let's sum up. The project charter influences the early scope management processes and all of the planning processes. The scope management plan affects schedule management, risk management, and stakeholder engagement. The requirements documentation impacts resource management, risk management, and stakeholder engagement. The requirements traceability matrix impacts quality and procurement processes. The schedule management plan, the milestone list, and the project schedule all have a direct impact on cost, risk, resource, communications, and stakeholder engagement processes. The activities list from schedule management is an input into cost and risk areas. All right, I suggest you go back to the beginning of this module and pause it on each screen so you can take a good look at the interaction and interrelationships between process groups. This understanding of how everything works together is going to help you a great deal in passing this exam. So remember the big ones. Schedule management and cost management affect each other. Schedule management and resource management affect each other. Cost management and resource management affect each other. Communications and stakeholder engagement affect each other. And risk management affects everything. All right, speaking of passing the exam, remember, choose any answer that includes negotiate, communicate, or speak directly, etc., when asked a question about conflict or managing the team. Choose any answer that suggests analyzing impacts on the baselines first when you're asked a question about change requests. Choose any answer that suggests updating plans, baselines, and documents first before you act when you are asked a question about implementing an approved change request. Always choose the best answer, not the correct answer. There can be more than one correct answer. You want the best answer. And finally, the PMP exam is about the PMP exam preparers. This exam is not about you or your job. You need to think like PMI to pass the PMP.